This video is going to illustrate the effects of temperature on enzyme activity and the effect of pH on enzyme activity. Notice there are 6 test tubes here. Numbers 1, 2, and 3 are going to look at temperature, and 4, 5, and 6 are going to look at the effects of pH on enzyme activity. The enzyme that we're going to be looking at is in the presence of these specialized cells found in a liver. And the name of the enzyme is catalase. Catalase. Note that it ends with ASE, as all enzymes do. Sometimes in order to get that liver down, you use this dropper to help it go down to the bottom of the test tube. Now the substrate that we're going to be working with is H2O2, which is also called hydrogen peroxide. Test tube 1 is room temperature, 30 degrees Celsius, liver, with the addition of the hydrogen peroxide. And if you look closely, the bubbles illustrate the reactivity of the enzymes, and they're a release of oxygen gas. And you could see that those bubbles go up to about less than halfway, but a little bit more than a quarter of the way up that test tube. It happened quickly. And now we're going to compare it to test tube number 2. Now test tube number 2 is going to have a chilled piece of liver. That liver has the enzyme catalase inside of its specialized cells. And that enzyme, we're going to determine if it is more reactive or less reactive with the presence of hydrogen peroxide substrate. So it looked like it had fewer bubbles than the room temperature, 30 degrees Celsius, liver. So it looked like number 1, the room temperature, liver, had the greatest reactivity compared to the 10 degrees Celsius, liver. Test tube number 3 is going to be looking at a warm piece of liver. In fact, that liver is at 90 degrees Celsius. And we're going to add the substrate, hydrogen peroxide. Oh, I don't see any bubbles. We'll add a little bit more. Again, no bubbles, no reactivity. In conclusion, we can say test tube 1, 2, and 3, the effect of temperature on enzyme activity. Looks like number 1, room temperature 30 degrees Celsius, was the most reactive. Number 2, the chilled liver, was fewer bubbles. less reactive. And then test tube number 3, no reactivity at all at 90 degrees Celsius. So therefore, the optimum temperature for this enzyme would be 30 degrees Celsius. Next, let's look at test tubes 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6 are going to determine the effects of pH on enzyme activity. First, we add a piece of liver. Again, the liver has the presence of catalase, an enzyme that is in the liver cells. And we're just going to push that down to the bottom. In test tube number 4, we're going to look at a neutral pH. A neutral pH is a pH of 7. And the most common substance that has a pH of 7 is water. So we're going to add a little water with the liver. And now that pH is 7. Now we need to add the substrate, and the substrate is the hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, to determine if there's any reactivity. And there is. So the bubbles, ooh, look at that, it's still going. It's still bubbling at the bottom. Bubbles are still being released. It looks like it went pretty high. Let's take a look at a different pH. So that was a neutral pH. Next, we're going to look at a low pH value. Now, low pH values are pH values of 0, 1, 2, 3, all those low numbers. And those have a special name, and those are called acids. So I'm going to add a bit of acid to this liver. Now, the liver is in an acidic solution. So the pH is approximately a pH of 2. So the pH is a low pH value. So we need to figure out, will a low pH react with the substrate hydrogen peroxide? So now we're going to add a little hydrogen peroxide. And it looks like a couple of bubbles formed, but not as many as the pH of 7. The pH of 7 had more reactivity than the pH of 2. Now, we're evaluating pH, and we evaluated the neutral pH, and we evaluated an acid pH. So we now need to look at a pH that's a high pH value. And a high pH value would be numbers greater than 7, maxing out at 14. So 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 would be high pH values. Those pH values, 8 through 14, have a special name. They're called bases. So I'm going to add some base to this liver. And that will make the liver pH rise or increase to a value of 13. So now this pH has a value of 13. Let's see what happens in the presence of the substrate hydrogen peroxide. So it looks, ooh, it's still bubbling. It looks like it went all the way up towards the top of the test tube, and it's still bubbling down at the bottom. So it looks like the test tube 6 is very reactive. In fact, we could say, using test tube 4, 5, and 6, we could say a pH of 13 is the most reactive. A pH of 7, neutral, is in the middle. And then the low pH, a pH of 2, had little to no reaction. So the effects of pH on enzyme activity would be as the pH is greater, the reactivity is greater. A low pH has little reactivity. A middle pH or a neutral pH has moderate activity. And a high pH has enormous activity. This is the effect of pH and temperature on enzyme activity in specialized liver cells.